Take your seats. We're going to get started.
This is amazing.
This is going to be an absolute minimal introduction because we can see who's giving our talk and this title up here. And I'm so very happy to introduce Carol. I'll just let her take over.
Thank you, Jennifer. Well, first of all, this is relatively new work, so that's got advantages and disadvantages. The advantages are it's new and you haven't heard it before. The disadvantages are that there are probably still glitches that we haven't sorted out, and I welcome any help in doing that. It grew out of a couple of different things. One is just probably the theme that, or the finding that got me involved in studying happiness almost 15 years ago, which is kind of amazing. It was a long time ago, but it's when I found it in rapidly growing middle-income developing countries, what was now known as the happy peasants and frustrated achievers, which is we found upwardly mobile people who were making big income gains. A large percentage of them were reported to be very unhappy or very dissatisfied with their economic situation. And then there were people who had no income gains at all, poor rural people who reported to be very happy. And I've just seen this time and time again in China and Russia and Peru, where I'm from, where I started with this. You see it also with migrants. You know, when you look at migrants who are in their destination city, their income has possibly quintupled from what it was before, and yet they report to be not only unhappy, but unhappy with their financial situation because their reference norm has changed. And some of the other work, newest work we've been doing, is looking at saying, okay, there seems to be this unhappiness associated with change, and maybe it's because of rising expectations, maybe it's because of reference norms change. But one question I have is maybe it takes some unhappiness and frustration to drive the search for change and agency. So we've done some work where we have data on the happiness of people who intend to migrate. They haven't migrated yet from Latin America. It turns out that they're basically frustrated achievers. They're wealthier and more educated than the average, but they're less happy and they're less satisfied with their economic situation before they migrate. Now, these are people migrating from South America, so they have to have means. They're not walking across the border to Mexico. These are people that are making, they're making an effort, and well, everybody makes an effort, but they have means and they're migrating to seek better opportunities. In any event, I've been very interested in this kind of unhappiness and change relationship and also its causal directions. And then secondly, there's increasing, and I think I've mentioned this several times in comments, but there's increasing consensus in the whole science of measuring well-being on these two distinct dimensions, which is hedonic or experience well-being, how you experience your day, your quality of life on a daily basis, and then evaluative well-being, how you evaluate your life as a whole. And then where does eudaimonic well-being, meaning or purpose, fit into those two? I mean, it could be that it fits into both. For example, I think it sort of fits better in evaluative well-being. If you think of your life as a whole, meaning or purpose are part of that. But there are also daily experiences which may not be particularly pleasant, like getting up in the middle of the night with a crying baby, and yet they're purposeful, right? I mean, so that, anyway, eudaimonic well-being is the one we know least about. I think it's the most interesting, and so this paper is also sort of trying to understand that dimension of well-being a bit more. When we were talking about the slavery thing, I mentioned these findings where we find that people with more means and agency seem to emphasize evaluative well-being more, and people with less means and agency seem to emphasize hedonic well-being more when they answer just open-ended questions. And there's some other work by Angus Deaton and Danny Kahneman based on the US, but it finds that hedonic well-being correlates only up to about median income, and then that relationship tapers off, versus evaluative well-being and income correlate all the way up the income ladder. And I'm not so sure that it's because income matters that much to well-being, but income gives people choices. Evaluative well-being is about, how you evaluate your life as a whole. If you have more income, you have more freedom, you have more choice, and you can choose what you want to do with your life. So I'm trying to get a little bit, or understand this relationship between sort of having choice, being able to control your life, having agency, and how it goes across these two well-being dimensions. So I have to figure out how to, there we go. So basically, in this paper, we're asking about eudaimonic well-being, and basically saying, are capabilities and agency better reflected in evaluative well-being or hedonic well-being? I think intuitively they would be more reflected in evaluative well-being, but that's something we're trying to find out. And then are means and capabilities associated with stress and frustration? So are achieving means and capabilities associated with stress and frustration, or maybe just having means and capabilities are associated with stress and frustration? So think about, think about the tortured scientist or economist trying to get a result, and you may have a day that's quite stressful and frustrating, and your data's not working, but overall, you're trying to achieve a purpose, and achieving that purpose gives you great satisfaction in the evaluative sense, although the achievement part of it may be associated with stress and frustration. And then thinking about the distribution of well-being, where people are on not the income distribution, but on the well-being distribution, do happier people assess agency and opportunities differently? Do they value them more or less? And then thinking about the income distribution, do richer people assess agency and opportunities differently? So this is what we ask in this paper. We have 4 hypotheses. Basically, the first is because evaluative well-being better reflects agency, proxies for capabilities and agency are more likely to be strongly correlated with evaluative well-being than hedonic well-being. The second hypothesis is means and capabilities, or the process of acquiring them, may be associated with stress and frustration. And that could be because of rising expectations. It could be because changes in time use, changes in norms of reference, all kinds of other things. And then the third hypothesis is individuals put different weights on different capabilities and means, and we include income as a capability and mean because it gives you, choices in life at different points of the well-being distribution. So our idea was that it's possible that the happiest individuals care less, are happy anyway. They may care less about income, and they may be happy regardless of whether or not they have agency. Maybe that's why we have the happy peasants. Again, I don't know. We're asking these questions. And the last hypothesis is depending on their level of agency or means, so how much they have in terms of objective capabilities, people may value the same tools and capabilities differently. And so here I'm thinking about this finding from Latin America, where people that are with more means and agency value their work and health more, versus the poor value having friends and family they can rely on at times of need more. So the work, I think it's, if you have some control over your life, you're going to value those tools to be able to control your life more. If you don't, you fall back on friends and family. There's some new work by Arthur Stone and Angus Deaton showing that religion may work that way as well. So anyway, so here's what, those are the questions we have.
Can you explain again the second hypothesis?
2?
Yeah.
Oh, that it could be that if you're trying to acquire, agency, or you're trying to earn more income, or you're trying to get more education, right, which in the end increases your evaluative well-being, or that's the objective, but that process may be associated with stress and frustration, with sort of lower levels of hedonic well-being. It's the idea of, can high levels of evaluative well-being coexist with low levels of hedonic well-being? Is that good? Okay, so we look, like several other papers, we use the Gallup World Poll. I won't go into it because I think it's been described about 6 times already in the course of this conference. If anybody has questions about the data, let me know. The one funny thing is the employment data only starts in about 2009, and you'll see the employment variables are actually pretty interesting in our findings. And then we use 4 questions. We use the Cantrell Best Possible Life question as our measure of evaluative well-being because that's what is in Gallup. Like Eugenio, I'm not totally crazy about that question because I think it has a very framed and relative component. We know, for example, it correlates much more closely with income than do more open-ended life satisfaction questions. But it's a question we have, and it's not a bad question either. Then we have a measure of positive hedonic well-being, which is, did you experience happiness yesterday, which is basically positive affect. And then 2 measures of negative hedonic well-being. Did you experience stress yesterday, and did you experience anger yesterday? And it turns out stress and anger are actually quite different. I mean, stress sort of, it's not the mirror opposite of happy, but they work in the expected directions a lot. And anger is always a little bit different. And Danny Kahneman makes a point that some people get pleasure out of being angry, so who knows? But so we separate, we do treat anger differently. And then we've got, I'm sure you can think of people like that, right? But so then then we have both subjective capabilities and we have objective capabilities. And our subjective capabilities are questions in the world poll, which say, do you have health problems that prevent you from doing any of the things people your age normally can do? Did you learn to do something interesting yesterday? Can people in this country get ahead by working hard or not? And are you satisfied or dissatisfied with your freedom to choose what to do with your life? And then in terms of objective capabilities, these are pretty straightforward. We look at income levels, education levels, and then employment status. That's good. We have full-time employed, self-employed, voluntarily employed, part-time. It turns out these are really very happy people, particularly in wealthy countries, people who are voluntarily employed part-time, and then unemployed, and then involuntarily employed part-time. That is not a happy status, particularly. And so I'm just going to show you 2 sets of results. There are more in the paper, but because of time. So basically our specification is, subjective well-being is a dependent variable, and we've got a vector of objective and subjective capabilities. Then we have individual level controls, household level controls, the obvious usual things. And then we have country dummies and year dummies, because we pool 5 years of the Gallup World Poll. And we use either logits or ordered logits, depending on the question. The Gallup poll is an ordinal question, ordered logit, and then the Cantrell ladder, and then the hedonic questions are 0 1s. Did you smile? Were you happy yesterday? Yes, no. There's a lot of argument about why they eliminated all the variation they could have done by having ordered questions there, but again, they're the questions we have. So what do we find? These are kind of interesting findings. We find that the kind of subjective capabilities variables, so the health problem, learned or did something interesting, people get ahead with hard work, satisfaction with freedom. Actually, these are not standardized coefficients, but since this was done, we did standardize them, we get the same findings. We find that the more subjective capabilities variables actually correlate much more closely with the hedonic well-being, with happy yesterday, for example, than they do with the best possible life. And then you get the reverse, which is these objective capabilities, education, income, correlate more closely with best possible life and much less closely with happy. If you can see, education and happy have no significant correlation at all. Education and stress are positively correlated, which is interesting. And education and anger are negatively correlated. So you see, again, anger goes differently. So what explains that? One, I think it could just be unobservables going on, in the sense that these are subjective questions, so there's more noise in the answers. And the hedonic, how happy were you yesterday, is picking up personality traits, but a lot of unobservables. Versus, as we know, the best possible life question is much more framed, and it correlates more closely with objective traits. But here's, just to give you, so we don't really get this very clear, we don't get, hypothesis 1 was sort of saying, well, all these capabilities variables should play out more strongly in evaluative well-being and less strongly in hedonic well-being. And we don't really get that. We get slightly more mixed findings. But there's some interesting ones. For example, employed full-time is, as expected, positive and significant with best possible life, the evaluative well-being question. It's negative and significant with happy yesterday. right? So here's an example of you're employed full-time. It's, you're achieving a means, you have agency, whatever it is, but it doesn't necessarily make you happy on a daily basis, right? And then employed full-time is positively correlated with both stress and anger. Now remember that this is around the world, so some jobs are probably a lot less nice than being an academic at Duke, but, and then, let's see, there were a couple of other ones that are, here's the voluntary employed part-time people, very happy. Also, stress, which is interesting. And then unemployed is negative, as you would expect, and then positive with stress and anger. So these findings are a little more mixed than we thought they would be. So here is, I think, where the most interesting findings in the paper are, but people may not agree with me. These are quantile regressions, where basically what you do is instead of just taking the average and how within a distribution and the coefficient on it, it weights points in the distribution differently. So it basically assesses the effects of the covariates at different points in the well-being distribution, right? And it weights data points depending on whether they are above or below the line of best fit. So what you're able to do is divide the distribution into the least happy people, into 4, and then up to the most happy people. So what do we find? We get a lot of support for our hypothesis 3. The magnitude of our coefficient estimates decrease from the least happiest quintile to the happiest quintile for the absence of a health problem, hard work, income, education, voluntary part-time unemployment, and unemployment. So, in other words, the happiest people seem to care less about all these things, or that bothers them less if they're negative. Learning has a U-shaped coefficient, so the least happy and the most happy people value learning the most. And full-time employment is actually negative for the happiest people, which is a finding that was echoed earlier. So if you just want to see these, I don't have too much more time, so I'm going to, we can always go back to these in the question, but as you can see, these are the happiest people, these are the least happy people, and you get this decline on absence of a health problem. If you look at education, for example, it goes, the sort of weight goes down as people get happier. The effect, income, matters much more to the least happy people than to the happiest people. Full-time employment goes from being positive for the least happy people to negative for the most happy people. And unemployment, the negative effect of unemployment is much stronger for the least happy people than it is for the happiest people. So there's something about just the happiest part of the distribution that they seem, maybe they're happy regardless of all these things. And if I knew more about genes in this sample, maybe that would be a helpful thing to tease out. Then finally, just last thing, we split the whole sample into quintiles. It's got problems because we're splitting a world sample into quintiles, so you probably have some of the wealthier people in some African countries in the same quintile with some of the poorest people in, Switzerland. Not much we could do about that. But our findings are kind of suggestive. They really only worked with the best possible life as a dependent variable. And we actually get almost the reverse of the well-being distribution findings, which is we find that, for example, things like the absence of a health problem and the importance of hard work actually increase from the poorest to the richest. So the richest value these things the most, hard work and income. No clear pattern for learning and freedom. And then we find that, if you remember, being unemployed was most negative for the least happy people and less important for the happiest people. It's the reverse. Being unemployed has the strongest negative effect on the wealthiest quintile. So maybe, I've been trying to think, maybe if you're unemployed but you want to be employed in a wealthy, successful cohorts, there's more stigma attached to it. Again, I don't know. This is all pretty new. So I will, these are the details on the quintile findings. They're also in the paper. I think I probably should just how much time do I
Got a
have?
minute left.
Okay. Well, I'd rather just conclude, I mean, I can go back to these in the questions. It's pretty much everything I said. We did some regional things where we split this. We thought maybe instead of quintiles, maybe it makes more sense to just compare regions, you know, the wealthy EU 15 countries, Latin America and Caribbean, and then the transition economies. And we find that the evaluative well-being questions are really the dominant relationships in the wealthiest countries for both all our capabilities variables, subjective and objective. For Latin America and Caribbean, we get that all the subjective capabilities variables correlate more closely with the hedonic well-being variables versus objective capabilities are better correlated with evaluative well-being. So I'm not really sure what drives that, except that I think that, you know, where the kind of line between, you know, where everybody has a lot of agency and evaluative well-being levels are higher anyway, that's probably driving that in the wealthier countries versus in Latin America. It's a more mixed story. And the transition economies are all over the map. So we have these 4 hypotheses, and it turns out that we get some of it all made sense and some was a little more confusing. I think it's pretty clear that this hedonic well-being better correlating with the subjective capabilities variables has a lot to do with kind of, one, the unobservables thing, but also, you know, if you are just naturally happy, you have high levels of positive affect, you're generally positive, you probably are less likely to report that you have a health problem, you're probably more likely to think that hard work will get you ahead. You know, there's kind of those kinds of things going on. Versus the evaluative well-being variables really capture objective things like income, education, actually objective measures of agency. We also find evidence of stress and anger coexisting with higher levels of evaluative well-being, the education findings, for example. And overall, the happiest people seem to value capabilities the least. Value is probably the wrong word, but they seem to be happy regardless of whether or not they have these means and agency. There's some other work based on quantile regressions just for Britain that also finds similar finding that the happiest people value income less, education less. I guess the kind of questions that I'm thinking about, once I get this story maybe a little bit more developed, is, you know, trying to answer, does the search for agency, opportunity, and progress, making change that really, you know, increase your evaluative well-being, does it invariably entail unhappiness in the sense of hedonic stress and anger? And also, policies that increase people's expectations and agency may also cause some unhappiness in the short term, right? I always think about this wonderful description by George Akerlof of these scholarship programs for kids in gangs in New York, and they gave these kids scholarships to go to Andover, Exeter, really good boarding schools, gave them a chance to get out of their gangs. They were talented kids. So they go to these fancy boarding schools, and they don't fit in. So they're so unhappy they go back to their gangs, but then they don't fit in the gangs, and it's a very sad story. But the point is, even though they were given sort of means and agency, their hedonic life, you know, their quality of life was so bad that they couldn't achieve their goals. So this short-term unhappiness, you know, maybe you can overcome it, and other times people don't. And then the one thing we want to do next, which we haven't done yet, is to use the German socioeconomic panel, a panel that everybody uses because it's so big and so long, to look at actual changes in agency. So how does changing your level of education, how does getting your law degree, or, you know, whatever, how do those, you know, play into this pattern? And I'm done.
I think so.
Okay.
Let's see.
Thanks. It's down there at the
Okay. Does this work? Okay. Well, thank you for having the conference. Thank you all for being here and listening to my work. This is the Earned Income Tax Credit, Health and Happiness, and this is joint work with Casey Boyd-Swan, Chris Herbst, and Homa Zarame. So the motivation for this research is pretty simple. I was really trained as a public finance economist, and a few years ago became interested in happiness, and then thought, how can we sort of use the insights of happiness to consider some of typical public finance questions? And so, there's lots of debate about the appropriate role of government, and in particular the social safety net. And so basically, and I think this is in line with a lot of what people have been saying, that we're not saying we want to replace standard outcome measures, but we think that subjective well-being measures should be considered as well in the evaluation and consideration of these programs. And some work on this direction's already been done, like more generous unemployment insurance appears to lead to greater subjective well-being. And there's some research by myself and one of my co-authors separately. That's actually how we met, is that we had similar papers showing that welfare reform increased subjective well-being. And then the second motivation just has to do with the impact of income on health and subjective well-being in general. We all know that these are positively correlated, but the evidence or the identification on causal links is much less solid. And so the EITC provides a plausible exogenous shock to income that we might be able to use to try and understand this. I'm going to provide a little more background than some of the other papers, because I don't know that everyone knows a lot about EITC, and this will help you understand what we did. But the EITC was created as part of the Tax Reduction Act of 1975. It was initially a 10% subsidy on earnings. It was intended to help low-income families, so you needed an eligible child to qualify. And it was seen as a work bonus and offset to the increase in the payroll tax. After 1975, the EITC has been expanded repeatedly, most notably through the Tax Reform Act of '86 and the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Acts of '90 and '93. If you're not familiar with the EITC, it basically has three regions. The first region is the phase-in region, where you're getting a wage subsidy. The second region, the plateau, is where the subsidy is constant and it's acting as a lump sum transfer. And then the third region is the phase-out region, where they're taking the credit away as you earn more money. And each of these acts increased all of the phase-in rates, the maximum credits, and the phase-out rates. Starting with the OBRA 90, they made a differential credit for families that had 2 kids versus 1 kid, and that was expanded further in OBRA 93. In addition, 17 states have their own EITCs, but since our research is really about 1990, only 4 states had their own EITC in 1989. And just to give you a magnitude of the size of the program, in 2010, there were about 26 million households receiving about $55 billion in credits in the U.S., and it's over twice the federal spending on TANF, which is the family assistance program that people generally call welfare. And there's a tremendous literature that I don't have time to focus on today, but some of the highlights are, that it's been shown that it increases unmarried mothers' labor force participation, but less clear effect on married mothers. It's been shown to decrease poverty. Lots of researchers have looked at the fertility and family formation questions about the EITC, but the evidence is mixed. And finally, some researchers have more recently started to look at the impact on children's well-being, and it seems to improve it. The kids' math scores and reading test scores have gone up, and it appears to increase infant birth weights and decrease smoking during pregnancy. So in terms of the impact of the EITC on health and subjective well-being, it's useful just to consider a very, very simple conceptual framework where individuals' choices around their consumption and leisure time activities might affect their health. And so, for example, the EITC may allow a recipient to purchase more healthy foods or other health-promoting goods and services. On the other hand, the EITC, for example, increases the opportunity cost of leisure time, and therefore people maybe exercise less or engage in less of those kinds of health-promoting activities. One paper does look at the health impact of the EITC. They use a slightly different methodology. They look at the comparison of mothers with 1 child to 2 children. They also use more physical health things, decrease in risky biomarkers, and they find that there's a decrease in risky biomarkers, especially inflammation, and a decrease in the number of days in the past month of self-reported poor health. Our research introduces happiness measures, a more comprehensive measure of mental health, and we also have some self-esteem measures, feeling of worthiness, satisfaction with self, and self-efficacy. And there's been a lot of talk about the different dimensions. So we're covering not all of them, but a lot of them. And this, we also are introducing a new data set to this research and looking at the 1990.
Just to clarify,
Yeah.
you don't think that there is no channel through labor supply at all?
Oh, no, yeah, no, I think it, yeah,
Oh, I guess leisure is labor
Yeah.
supply.
yeah,
Okay.
I'm sorry. Non-market time, which is the inverse of work, yeah. Okay, so we'll just present the data, our identification strategy, descriptive statistics, results, and discussion the rest of the time here. So we're using this survey called the National Survey of Families and Households, and it's a nationally representative panel of about 10,000 adults who speak English or Spanish, and it was actually primarily designed for demographers interested in family and households. And so this actually enables us to carefully identify qualifying children, including relationships and residency requirements, as well as determining student and disability status. So lots of studies that look at EITC don't have such detailed family composition data, and so we think this is a slight advantage we have. There's also, the wave 1 in 87, 88 that precedes over 90, and wave 2, 92 to 94 that succeeds over 90. And it also includes an oversample of minority and single family households, which is useful in our case. The specific questions we have a happiness question, taking all things together, how would you say things are these days, where one is defined as very happy and someone is defined, very unhappy, someone is defined as very happy. This is a global measure of happiness, similar to other questions with a slightly different scale. We have the Center for Epidemiological Studies depression scale, which asks the number of days during the past week that you felt or experienced one of 11 items, including bothered, depressed, everything in effort, and so on. The way we use this scale, although now I'm reconsidering this based on the conversation, is we combine it into a composite number, where if you report 0 days, we code it as 0. If you report 1 to 2 days of a specific feeling or experience, we code it as a 1, 3 to 4, 2, and 5 or more, 3, and then we sum, so you get a scale from 0 to 3 to 3. That's the standard way to code the scale, but perhaps we should focus more on the individual items as well, which we don't in the paper right now. This is a widely used scale, and it's considered appropriate for use to the general population. And then we have some other dimensions of self-esteem, and it's basically agreement with worthiness, satisfaction with self, and do things as well as others. In terms of how do we identify the impact of the EITC on health and subjective well-being, well, we use a difference in difference estimator, which is very standard in the literature, but again, if you're not public finance economists, you might not be familiar with this, but the basic idea is as follows. What we're going to do is we're going to look at the impact on an outcome, let's say happiness, on the target population, in this case mothers, before and after. So we get a difference in mothers' happiness before and after the expansion of the EITC. However, of course, this could be caused by a whole load of factors. And so what we do is then we difference out, or we try and control for other factors other than the EITC by differencing out the second difference here, which would be the outcome for a similar group but not affected. So generally people use childless female respondents because they are believed to participate in similar labor markets but are unaffected by the EITC. And the results I'm going to present are first employment. I present the employment results here just because we wanted to verify, since this is a new data set to look at EITC, that they're similar to prior results, and they are. Then the depression scale, happiness, and the self-esteem measures. And finally, we limit the sample to respondents ages 55 and under and education high school or less, and that's standard to focus the analysis on those who are most likely to actually be affected by this change. So to save time, I didn't give you the whole descriptive statistics. I just summarized them here for you, which is that unmarried mothers compared to unmarried childless women are less likely to be employed, score higher on depression, are less happy and lower self-esteem, and married mothers compared to married childless women, similar but less pronounced, and all mothers are younger, more likely to be non-white, and more likely to not have completed high school. So to estimate...
Sorry, John,
yeah.
wait a minute, all mothers are younger
In our data set, the mothers are younger on
than the
average.
childless women?
Yes.
Yeah, I remember, I think I've asked you this before,
Yeah.
but it's weird.
Yeah, yeah. So, yeah, I don't have a good story other than that's what is
Okay.
Is it children at home, or is it like all like if a 55-year-old woman whose children are grown?
No, so
Does she count as a mother?
to have a qualifying child, I skipped over that, sorry. you have to have a child who is living in your household.
Okay.
Yes, so these are children who live in the house. So these are not like empty nesters. These are full nesters only.
Right. So I think that could explain something.
Full nesters.
Not empty nesters. Thank you. Okay. So to estimate our difference in difference estimator, which is alpha post-treatment, we regress our outcome measures on post-treated, the interaction term, which gives us our difference in different estimator, and then we control for the standard things that we have, like age squared, race, marital status, education, number of kids. We include state fixed effects, which are also interacted with the post variable, and we're going to be using OLS with robust standard errors clustered by subject, just to make the interpretation of the coefficients easy. So first, our replication of prior results on the employment effects. So you can see in Model 1 we have no covariates, Model 2 we have covariates. I'll just focus on Model 2. The coefficient of 0.08 implies that there's a 0.08 increase in the percentage of women, the percentage points increase in mothers who are working compared to non-mothers before and after the expansion. And you can see the pre-treatment level of working among that group was about 52%, so it's a pretty large increase. And as with prior research, when we focus only on the unmarried mothers, the result stays the same. However, when we focus on married mothers, and the research on this, as I said, is less clear, there's been different results. At least when we have all our covariates, the coefficient is not significant anymore. So we feel like this sort of replicates prior research. And now on to what people are interested in at this conference. So in terms of the depression scale, and again, this is coded from 0 to 33, where 33 would be the highest score, most depressed, 0 being the least depressed. We have a negative and statistically significant coefficient in both models of about -1, and you can see the pre-treatment mean was about 10. So this is about a 10% reduction in reports of depression after the expansion of the EITC relative to, again, childless women. And this is where the paper, I think, gets really interesting, which is that although the coefficients on unmarried women are negative, they're clearly not even close to statistically significant. But for married women, the coefficient is statistically significant and negative. In other words, the depression benefits are being felt by the married mothers, but not the unmarried mothers. And this is going to follow through. We'll see here with the happiness. And we have mixed results here on all women. And, you know, I've been looking at Model 2, but you can see here, for unmarried women, there does not appear to be a happiness benefit. But for married women, there is a happiness benefit. It's marginally statistically significant, but in line with what we saw with the depression scale. And then finally, agreement with these self-esteem measures. Again, mixed evidence here with all women. Interestingly, even negative, but not statistically significant coefficients here for married mothers, for unmarried. But for married mothers, at least with feelings of worthiness and doing things as well as others, positive and statistically significant. So we have evidence that, for married mothers, at least, the EITC has decreased depression, is suggestive that it increases happiness, and increases some measures of self-esteem. And we do a whole series of specification checks I don't have time to go through in detail, but we include months of the interview indicators. We drop 1994 observations because the 93 reforms were partially implemented in 94. Doesn't change the results. We use year dummies in place of post dummies because in the post period there were 3 years of survey collection data. We use state-specific linear time trends, and we use a falsification test. We remove the age and education restrictions, and all of our noteworthy statistical results go away. So what we think we've accomplished is we've identified the impact of a change in a safety net program on health and subjective well-being. And again, we don't say that other measures shouldn't be looked at, but we're just saying this is an important thing to consider also. We've added to the conversation, we believe, about the causal impact of income on health and subjective well-being. And, really interesting to me, we've found consistent variant impacts for married and unmarried mothers. Where married mothers, their labor supply or labor force participation rate does not appear to change, but we get these improvements in subjective well-being, and then sort of the opposite for the unmarried mothers. And of course, we'd like to know why, but
Does
we
the
don't.
participation, labor force participation rate change for the unmarried mothers? Do you get an increase in labor force participation for unmarried mothers?
It with no covariates it was positive, but with covariates it was insignificant. But the coefficient was positive. So I guess no. Yeah. Thank you.
Do you want us both to come down there?
Yeah, I'll come down and I'll move over here so I can see. All right, so we'll just open up to discussion. We'll see how it goes. Let's start with if you have a follow-up to the current question or something, try the two fingers up or something like that. So I'll try and keep us all get everything that's relevant at one time. Yeah, are you there?
So to Carol, so this is very interesting. I'm wondering if, so I know it's a data limitation, so the answer might be no. But you used, for a lack of better proxy, I guess, proxies for capabilities, so income, etc. But of course, there have been attempts to develop direct kind of survey measures of different functionings and capabilities. And I wonder if there is already any data set that actually have both the evaluative/affective well-being measures and then some direct survey questions that look at capabilities and functionings, and then we can try to look more directly.
I don't know of one, if there is. I mean, I know the literature you're referring to that where it's really trying to spell out what these capabilities and functionings are. I mean, there may be some small data sets, and then one could look sort of at a smaller scale, but nothing on the scale of the Gallup World Poll. I mean, I could look. I probably should look again at other variables in the Gallup World Poll that might get closer. But as far as, I mean, we did a pretty good scrub, and those were the questions that we felt were about as close to the sort of mirroring that literature, I guess, without, being the same actual variables.
Question for John. I love the fact that you actually have kind of identification for the income effect. It doesn't have the problems of interpreting correlation that almost all of the studies have. I'm wondering if you could say something more quantitative about the effect of income per se, because you should know, based on the number of children, what the income subsidy is that a family is getting. And maybe it depends on their income, so you have to make a guess about that. But it would be interesting to compare what your evidence seems to be saying about the size of the estimates relative to the correlational evidence.
We have not tried that yet, but we should be able to do something absolutely, and that's a good suggestion. So, yeah, but I don't have a back of the envelope calculation for you, but I will try it and let you know.
John, I thought this is a great example of well-being policy. Thank you. And Carol, I really I like the bringing nuance, the complexities to the picture here. My question for Carol is, on the one hand, I worry about that life evaluation, the ladder measure. I wonder how much of the data you're getting reflect the biases people toward material concerns. So the fact that, say, it's best possible life, that itself was going to prime people, you would think anyway, to think of like swimming pools and yachts, because imagine the best possible life for yourself. Well, you quickly run out of things like love, and you're thinking yachts. And so that might skew the results away from other things people value, and then on the capabilities agency end of things, it's not, especially at the lower end of the income spectrum, it seems really tricky to figure out, well, what really counts as higher agency, say. So say somebody, a young man who's, got a 8th grade education, working in, part-time employed in an urban slum, may have higher income, more employment, and more formal education than a subsistence farmer, somebody in a rural area, but may, in intuitive respects, still be, in some sense, less knowledgeable, less skilled, have less agency, and may have less control over his daily routine. And I wonder if there might be some discontinuity where actually you get some loss of agency as people initially move into urban areas, and then it gets better as they move up.
Really good points. On the latter question, I've made that critique of that question a lot. In fact, I think we know that it correlates more closely with income across and within countries than does open-ended life satisfaction. And my whole take on this, vicious debate about whether or not there's an Easterlin paradox or not has a lot to do with the question you use. And the latter question correlates much more closely than, life satisfaction and then happiness, overall happiness correlates even less closely, right? So that it kind of depends what you want to measure. Yes, I think because of the way the question is framed, it definitely picks up more, whether it's concerns about income or things that income makes available for people much more than the more open-ended questions, and I think that does affect the results. It shows up. In terms of you're at the bottom end, I very much agree. I think one of the things that I don't know the extent to which, I don't know, and this is my first sort of take on all this agency stuff, the sort of formal agency literature, other than just trying to understand eudaimonic well-being, but I don't know if agency is relative, but I think it probably has some relative dimensions. It's like the Adam Smith's thing about if you're a worker in London, you have to have a shirt and shoes, and so all of a sudden, you need more money to just be okay. But your shirt and shoes are the agency so you can get a job or whatever. Without them, you can't. So with these, as you compare somebody who's in control on their subsistence farm, and then they decide they're going to lead a better life and migrate to the city, and they get to the city and they may have a job where they're earning 5 times more than they were before, but they have a nasty boss. All of a sudden there's crime, there's uncertainty, and there's, in lots of ways, a lot less control, right? So I think your example is a good one. It's hard to know as people are, and I think that has as much to do with the discontinuities that you mentioned, but also just the process of trying to acquire agency.
You behind Dan, I'm sorry, I don't know your name. You would have.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So John, this is just a question. I don't know
Yeah.
whether it means anything or not, but the married women in your sample, are they filing as heads of household to get the EITC, or are they merely in households that are receiving the EITC?
Yeah, they're in households that are getting the EITC.
Uh-huh.
So presumably a lot of them are married to people who are working, but
So maybe their spouses who are filing as heads of household, whereas the unmarried women would be filing as heads of household.
you mean on their tax form?
Yeah.
Yeah. But that's what's interesting about the EITC and married women in particular. And if you, again, stereotyping, if you take women as the second earner in the household, that's why the EITC might not have positive impact on the labor force participation of married women. And that it's more of a pure income shock, whereas for single mothers, they're the only income earner in the household.
And you can imagine that being a single mother earning at that level, that working full-time is pretty stressful.
It's very stressful, yeah. So you see and that's why I think that dichotomy is so interesting, and that comes out, I think, very clearly in the data, that it's really the married mothers who are benefiting in a subjective well-being sense. from the.
Quick follow-up, is there any way to separate out households, married households where women are filing as heads of household versus households where their spouse or partner is
I
filing
don't,
as head?
it has really detailed household data. I don't know if it indicates who's the tax filer, though. But I could, I can look back at the data, I just don't remember. But there's very detailed household data, so it might be there. Yeah.
Is yours a follow-up?
No.
No. So then, Peter Railton, right.
Yeah, Carol, I think you already raised the point that I wanted to mention, namely that people who are migrating into a new society, even though that was an exercise of agency, may experience a loss of agency in the new society initially. And there's a sort of miniature experiment that you mentioned where you're taking kids from very poor urban neighborhoods and putting them in Andover and Exeter. You might think, oh, well, we're giving them more capabilities. But in fact, locally, what they're probably experiencing is a lack of ability to control their situation and a loss of agency in their new situation. And the fact that they are not happy in that setting and want to leave, that's like a little miniature example of this effect. So it's hard to know how to understand agency, but I think it's got to be relative in the way that you describe. So your feasibility set, what you've got by way of skills and how you can cope.
Yeah, probably coping, assimilating and coping are probably
Yeah.
two big parts of it. I mean, one of the things
Right.
we're going to do with this migrant work that I mentioned, where we've looked at unhappiness of migrants before they migrate, we've got some initial results with doing these propensity matching things, so it's pretty imperfect, but which suggests that they're already a little bit less unhappy once they get to where they go, but they're still less happy than natives. But we want, over time, if after they're somewhere for 5 years, does their well-being increase as they assimilate, or not? I don't know, but it's something we'll be.
Right, and similarly, agency is going to be relative to your goals. So if you imagine that those people are ones who come with very high income goals, or something like that, then even after a certain amount of time, they might experience lower subjective well-being because of the distance between them and their goal and their inability to close that distance. So again, agency is going to have these various elements of relativity, it seems. And I guess there is evidence that people who set these high income goals are in general less satisfied with life.
Well, and it may be that if you remember the quantile regressions, that the happiest people sort of care less about
the happiest
income,
people care less about that stuff.
Least happy people care more about it.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
don't know the direction of quantile.
Thanks.
So I think my own system or my proposed system of trying to keep track of secondary comments fell by the wayside by my fault. So if I'm moving on and your comment, I've got quite a few people in the queue, was relative to what we're moving away from, just yelp a little or something. Matt I have next, and then you're in the back. You're next after that.
So Carol, I mean, as you know, I think this is wonderful work. I think it's great to think about EWB as a measure of agency capabilities. But I worry a lot in general about rescaling and what the scale means. And so 2 questions, both relating to scale. So one is you find that H1 is not strongly confirmed, right? You'd expect a strong relationship between agency capabilities, however measured, and of course you have to get all those, right? And EWB. I mean, one possibility, of course, is that as people have more agency capabilities, they rescale how much agency capabilities they need to achieve various numerical targets. I mean, the best evidence of that is, as I'm sure you know, von Prague's work, where he said to people, how much income is really good, how much income is sufficient, and so forth. And their answers changed as they had more income, right? So the categories of income that they classify as being 10, 9, 8, and so forth is itself a function of income. Now, this is a general issue, but that could be part of what's going on with respect to H1. It's just that as people have more agency, their sense of what a lot of agency is gets higher. With respect to H3, here it's not a rescaling issue, but a scale compression issue. That is, if people tend to say, with respect to HWB on the 5 or whatever, that imagine that, in God's mind, there's a scale of HWB. It could be that the range of that scale covered by 5 to 6, right, is less than the range covered by 6 to 7, 7 to 8, and so forth. So given that kind of scale compression effect, you'd expect a smaller coefficient than all the capabilities with respect to HWB, the higher up you go up on the HWB scale, right? Now, again, I'm not sure how you would get around that, but there's no reason to assume that people understand, you know, these unit moves, or that these unit moves correlate to, in some sense, genuine unit moves in happiness at every point on the happiness scale.
Okay, on your first point, I agree with you, and I think, if I'm hearing you right, that it's likely that people rescale more in terms of EWB than HWB, right?
Yes.
Because, you know, you're not, if somebody asks you, did you smile yesterday, you're not, you're not changing a reference norm about it, it's very straightforward. But if somebody's asking you to, you know, evaluate your life as a whole on a 10-scale ladder with the best possible life, that, I agree with that. I'm a little less, I may not be understanding you right on the third hypothesis was sort of that people in different points in the well-being distribution might value capabilities differently. And so we use that distribution's based on the best possible life scores. So it's based on the EWB measure.
Right, okay.
So I just don't think I understand your scaling question, how it affects our findings on that.
So can I ask a clarification, because I had a related question, which is, I'm worried you might have a ceiling effect, and maybe the data can alleviate this concern, but you know, when you break things down into quantiles, if the happiest quantile is a 9 out of 10, it's very hard for them to get happier. Not because they can't get happier from where they are, but because they can't respond that they improved 2 units, right? They're stuck at where they're at the top end of the scale, and that's where you get that compression effect where, you know, this other stuff can't make me happier because I already indicated on the scale as happy as I can be, or very close to it.
But we're not asking them what would make them happier. I mean, we're just seeing how these things correlate, how their hedonic well-being and how their answers on these agency questions correlate. But they don't know they're being asked that. We're just saying if you're at this point in the distribution, how do these variables correlate with your well-being if you happen to be in this place of the well-being distribution?
Right.
So I don't see why the ceiling effects would. I understand ceiling. I mean, I know they're a problem potentially with all the literature, but I just don't know why they would.
Because if you're looking at things that affect subjective well-being, you know, say employment can't have, like, the directional effects are still interesting, but if you're going to say that something is going to increase subjective well-being, if the mean in that top quantile is 9.5, then you're necessarily going to have a smaller effect from these independent variables.
Right. Interestingly enough, you get a negative effect, but on employment, but.
Right. So, but for the things that are
be
positive,
right,
you could get that.
So H3 is equally confirmed with respect to EWB and HWB measures, is that right? Or H3 was just tested using EW measures?
EWB measures.
So what do you find if you use HWB? Because intuitively, I would expect more compression with respect to HWB than EWB somehow.
The problem with the hedonic well-being,
it's just binary here?
It's a binary variable, so we wouldn't have we can't really do a distribution.
And there's no Gallup question that says how happy are you on a scale of 0 to 7 or anything like that?
No, I don't think so. They have a life satisfaction, but it's binary,
Yeah.
which is annoying.
Mm-hmm.
So you would expect more compression on the
Well, I'm not sure, but I mean, so one, it seems to me, as you said earlier, that it's less plausible that people sort of keep rescaling the scale of, you know, felt happiness or felt affect.
Right.
But also that when people, if people, even people not particularly happy, or neutral, say, you know, use 5 to express neutrality, then a move from, say, 8 to 9 is going to correspond to a much bigger hedonic change than a move from, say, 5 to 6. That's the worry. And that would then explain why you see lower coefficients on all these independent variables with respect to people at the top than people in the middle.
I'm not that familiar with quantile regressions, but when the standard errors, in the case of the top, the standard errors would grow a lot because you don't have a lot of variance on the left-hand side. So you should,
Yeah,
but they're still significant.
they're
so,
significant.
Yeah, I'm saying, but so.
I mean, I take the point. I just think, I don't think that's all that's going on,
Yeah.
precisely because.
Yes.
I was just thinking about some of the findings in Carol's paper related to Matt Adler's talk yesterday. I'm wondering if you think I'm making a valid or at least useful connection, which is, for example, the finding that people with, and this is I think also in the Deaton and Kahneman paper, that with not only higher income but higher education, they have higher life evaluation but also higher stress. So the day-to-day hedonic happiness plateaus or isn't increasing after some point. And so I wondered if that is consistent in some ways with Matt's point that we should think about what people's preferences as not only including their momentary experiential happiness, but also, for example, things they'd like to achieve. So if people with higher education are thinking more about achievement, and they might thereby exhibit less momentary happiness because of the stress, but greater life evaluation is that life evaluation picking up some of those kinds of preferences for achievement that Matt thinks are important? And so that leads me to the last point of the question, which is I always find it difficult when Matt says there are things that we care about that it's not all just in our head, but there are preferences that we have that are not just our mental state, because I'm wondering, where are those preferences? It seems to me there's some place in the mind, although they may be different from the kinds of momentary experienced happiness, which could be trivialized as cheerfulness or something else. But they're someplace in our psyche. So maybe those are being partially reflected in the overall life evaluation measures. So that's a question of whether you have any agreement or disagreement or reaction to that kind of characterization.
Well, I just, on your first point, I very much agree with you. That's what we were trying to test out, and I'm wishing we could get a better handle on, because I think that's a eudaimonic component of well-being. And, my sense is that it's captured in the evaluative measures, but I'd like to know more about it, and this is sort of a first step. But I'll let Matt answer about that.
Preferences are mental states, right? Preferences are pro-attitudes. But the point is that the objects of preference, what you prefer, need not be a mental state, right? So I might prefer that I'm happy. In that case, both the pro-attitude and what is preferred is a mental state. Or I might prefer, not to be cheated on by my spouse, in which case the pro-attitude is a mental state, but what I prefer is something out there in the world. Now, I think we both agree that the objects of preference can be things other than mental states, and that, agency and income and all these sorts of things are useful means to accomplish lots of things, including the realization of preferences for things other than mental states. The only disagreement, I think, between us is that I think Carol is more comfortable. I'm more of a skeptic about the use of EWB as a proxy for the extent to which people realize their preferences, and you're, I think, more optimistic about that. And that difference in turn has to do with worries about rescaling and so forth. But I think but the point is that, yes, the preference is a mental state, but, it's something that it latches out onto features of the world and says, gee, I would like that world better than this world, right? And because I like this world better than this world, I'm going to, make choices in various ways, and I'm going to say various things in surveys. But again, the future of the world that's latched onto need not be the preferred mental state. I mean, that's really the thing. And I don't think you disagree with that. I mean, again, the issue now is really now this measurement issue so given that area of agreement, then the question is, well, how do you measure that? And your thought is, well, if we ask people about their evaluated well-being, we're getting a good proxy for the extent to which they're realizing their preferences. And my worry is, well, but if we're getting them to put numbers, then we got to be confident either that there's some fixed scale or that the rescaling is random. And if rescaling correlates with changes in agency capabilities, that is worrying to me.
Well, that's one thing we're going to look at changes in the next stage, sort of what happens when you have a change in education, and we could look at the rescaling thing explicitly.
That would be great.
So next I have Eugenia, and
Okay.
then after that, Walter.
I think it's nice, this idea of emphasizing even more than what Kahneman and Deaton did, this difference between country ladder essential and happiness and satisfaction. I really like this perspective. There is something I don't like about country ladder, and this is what? If you feel sad, the first thing you do is, well, I could be sadder, to cheer you up. And this is what the country ladder does, essentially. Make you thinking of another possible state of the world where you could be worse. Now, and this, I think, will be connected with Jenny's talk. Individual, particularly sad, might not have a good perception of what their life would be in another state, right? So this, in my view, add an element of arbitrariness to the country ladder.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you in terms of the country ladder does, as you said in the conversation that we had last night, it may make people focus more on income dimensions. It's kind of Dan's point, too.
So my question actually goes all the way back to this example of the person moving from the rural environment to the urban environment. And it made me, I started to wonder whether I really understand the measure of agency and capability. Because when somebody moves from a rural to an urban environment, well, they lose the capability maybe to see their mother as often, but they gain the capability to see movies more often. And they lose the capability to, eat fresh vegetables that they grew themselves, but they gain the capability to eat the ethnic foods of other cultures. And it's like they're gaining some capabilities and losing other capabilities. And it's not clear to me how you decide which are more. Like, did they actually gain overall or lose? They're gaining. Now, you can always say, did they gain ones that were important to them? But now you're not looking just at levels of capability anymore. You're looking at, their value judgments. You can say, how do they stand the capabilities relative to the people in their neighborhood? But that doesn't tell you whether they gained by moving from urban to rural. So I guess my question is really, how do you measure whether they gained in capability or agency overall?
Right, and I guess here it's quite important to distinguish between agency and capabilities as well. So I think about agency as kind of the ability to make choices, control your life, to take up opportunities, right? And capabilities is kind of, what you do with that. So clearly by moving to the city, they gain agency in the sense that there's more their children can go to school, there are more jobs available, there's more communication, there are all kinds of things that allow them to make choices. Do they make, is going to the movies all the time, that's a capability. Is that better than being able to go visit your mother? That's normative, right? And that's also maybe where this relative dimension comes in. So you get somewhere where all of a sudden you have all these choices and some ability to take advantage of them, but maybe that's maybe if you don't, if you lack certain other things, you can't really take those up, right? So, you know, I think it's pretty, it's very complicated. This is all very new, trying to measure this is all very new, so I'm not sure I've got a good handle on it. I mean, the questions that we focused on as proxies for agency were very much about the ability to make choice and to do things. So not being limited by your bad health, you know, believing that your efforts will pay off. You know, if you work hard, you can get ahead. Kind of learning, your capacity to learn, you know, that seems to be associated with ability to make choice. And then being, you know, feeling you have freedom to choose what you're doing with your life. They all sort of, in my view, reflect that ability to make choices, but that are far from perfect.
What I understand is, you say the ability to do things, right, and to make choices, but you have the ability to do different things in the city than you do in the urban, and you make different choices. You have different options.
I mean,
in front of you.
here I
But
think.
how do you say which is more? How do you-
Here I think the kind of just plain old development economist in me comes out, and I think poor rural life is glamorized. You know, you're on your farm and it's all very nice and you grow your own vegetables, but your kids are going to die of a preventable disease before the age of 5, and you're probably going to die before you're 40. I mean, that's just from a welfare perspective inferior, and you aren't really able to. If your only way of making a choice is to get on a bus and migrate, or to go across a border, or to, whatever it is for 2 days to get away from where you were, it suggests to me that where you were, you weren't able to make too many choices, right? It's your choices about survival, mainly.
Yeah, it seems to me then the bottom line is all about life and health, not choices and things you can do.
No,
And arguably
I disagree. I think in the absence of decent health and education and other things, you can't make any choices. Once you have those, hopefully there are choices available, but that's not a given either, right? So it's like income is necessary but not sufficient to reduce poverty, right? So if you just give poor people handouts of income and they have no agency, they don't have there are no job opportunities, they can't do anything with it, they're going to always be poor unless they have these income handouts, right? So in the same way, if your health is compromised, and all you can do is subsist, even if there are choices, you can't take advantage of them. But just having health won't produce the choices. So I think there's kind of a necessary but insufficient bottom line in terms of work and health, but that's not all of it.
So I guess, and then I'll just be quiet, but I'm still worried about it, because it seems to be somebody, who's on a farm and they're happy on a farm. Maybe they are going to die younger, but they want to be able to go to the building that they grew up in. And what matters to them is to be able to see their relatives and so on. They move to the city, well, they're going to live longer, right? They're going to have more education, more wealth. But they don't care about that. The only reason they're building up the wealth and getting the higher income is so they can send it back to the relatives that they really care about that now they never see again. And so I don't know how to say whether the agency has gone up or not, because in a way they've gained these new abilities and maybe they're healthier and they're going to live longer, but
Why don't they
that's
go
not
back?
what they care about.
What percentage of migrants go back?
I don't know.
None. Very, very few. Both within countries and across countries. So if the farm was so great, why don't they go back?
Well, maybe because they care more about the options in the city. I don't know what they. I guess which options they care about is a different question from whether they're gaining the overall and the number of capabilities or level of capabilities they have.
Yeah, it's good. I just think I think that when you say the peasant on the farm is happy, that's a question of happy in what sense?
I
The sense.
wasn't saying that.
Okay.
I was saying they have certain capabilities that they lose when they go to the city. I wasn't putting it in terms of happiness. I meant to be putting it in terms of capabilities. That's what confuses me, is where capabilities fit.
Well, there's, maybe the best way to answer it is Sen's famous quote about, if a poor peasant who has no choice but to take joy in simple pleasures because he's destitute and reports to be happy, what are you going to do with that data point, right? It's kind of the capability. I guess the capability to see your family is a capability. It's not really the capability in the sense that I think about agency and capabilities. It's just kind of where you were born and there's your family. And they're very nice and you love them. There's nothing wrong with that, but I don't see that as a capability.
I don't know what the measure of.
Do you sacrifice-
I'm capable of seeing them in one situation, I'm not capable of the other. That's the sense in which I'm calling it a capability. It's something I'm capable of doing when I live in the rural environment, that I'm not capable of doing when I move to the city.
Right.
I have two people who look like they want to jump in on this point, Eric and you, sir. And then you were actually next in the queue, so
well,
after these 2 points, just go, okay?
So it seems to me that you're pointing to fairly deep problems within the capability approach, right?
Yes.
So when Sen talks about this, he's talking about capabilities as anything you can be and do. And if that's everything you're going to say about this, then you're going to end up with this massively multi-dimensional measure with no principled basis to compare one state to another. And so it's really a general problem for anyone who's buying into that sort of approach.
yes.
So I think I have a similar question on a different aspect of this. This is for you again, Carol. I really liked the way you motivated your study with your description of the intuition sort of behind it. And then as you got into the study, I'm interested in how you relate the intuitions that motivated the study to the actual measures that you have. And I had, I think, a similar question on a different dimension, namely the hedonic measure. You did a really nice job of describing sort of a tension in the various things that are measured, or the responses, but it seems that what ends up is there's a bucket of things that are deemed negative and a bucket of things that are deemed positive, and some kind of linear measure constructed. Whereas, and it lost the, what you described, just pick frustration. Is frustration a good thing or a bad thing? If I were to think about my own hedonic well-being and ask myself, how much frustration is appropriate? I would say not zero. I don't want to be in a sort of state of complete complacency. And I don't know that would be my best hedonic well-being state. And I wonder whether you had thought about, so we had a discussion on the capability side of how many dimensions ought to go into, constructing this thing. I was thinking the same thing on the hedonic well-being. Would it be better to have a multi-dimensional, or somehow try to tease multiple dimensions out of this, so we're not stuck with saying, well, am I, just sort of, did I go up the scale or down the scale, when in fact I might have moved in different directions? And I'll just stick with this, the level of lack of satisfaction or frustration, or the emotive side of, that causes us to strive. And is there a measure of being in a good place? It really comes back a little bit to the point you were making, Jennifer, yesterday in your theory of well-being. And that would seem more in line with the intuitions that you use to motivate the talk than going back to a sort of linear measure. And possibly that approach might also help on the capabilities side, although that might be much more complex.
Yeah, that's a complex one. I don't know. I still can't quite, I need to think about it more. But I don't think we really have a linear measure. I mean, I explained it very well. Just two things. We're definitely finding that you can have high levels of evaluative well-being that correlate with, for example, education, and yet that correlates negatively with, or positively also with stress, right? So education.
I'm talking just in the hedonic well-being, just measures of that. Right? is that a single or a multi-dimensional issue?
I think that, I'm not a psychologist, but I believe the ones I work with, because they seem to be pretty good ones. But they make it, they're adamant about the fact that positive experience and negative experience are different things, and they're not one continuum. So that stress and, happy yesterday and stress don't just run like that, that they're, and it's plausible that you could be both, right? Or happy and angry yesterday, maybe more plausible, who knows? And so for the, so I guess I don't see this as any of it as sort of one linear continuum. And then I agree with you that I haven't quite, I have a motivation for the study and I haven't quite answered it yet, because one of the things that we were just looking for these patterns for starters, but what I think would be much better at answering the question about, sort of what does frustration cause, or do you need a certain level of frustration to make changes, is to do this work looking at changes. So people that make either a major change in education or change in a job or migrate. I mean, some of this stuff we're still trying to do, looking at whether unhappiness proceeds along certain lines, hedonic or evaluative, depending, we don't know yet, precedes the change, or does the change, or is it a result of the change? And then and maybe that all shifts around over time. It's not a great answer, but we're just trying to figure it out.
Yeah, right. Well, if I can just, my question was not, I think I understand and appreciate the goals of your study. And so you've got, the intuitions that motivated, you have the data, and then you have kind of your conclusions. And my question is really to ask you more about what you thought the measures were the right measures, and whether having a positive relationship between these various things was useful, or whether it was, there was no declaration that we must have only two measures of well-being. And so I was asking, is the hedonic one best conceived as having dimensions possibly independent, and looking, for correlations at a slightly finer grain, just I think as Walter was saying, well, are we perhaps better off looking at the other measure of happiness, at least in a couple of different dimensions, rather than just, looking for positive, negative effects in a kind of a scalar way?
Yeah, well, no, I clearly agree with you. You have to look at different dimensions of hedonic well-being. We only have, one evaluative measure if we wanted to look at more of those. So I think we agree. Unless I'm not missing something.
I wasn't disagreeing. I was just asking you to, help me think about it.
I still have, thank you. You're next, and then you.
Much more rudimentary question. It's a question for John. The measures that you're talking about, you're looking at people who not necessarily are collecting the EITC, but people who qualify for the EITC. Is that right?
They're eligible for
eligible,
it.
Right? Okay.
Yeah.
Based on
based on having we're not controlling for income. So in these kinds of different type strategies, what you really want to do is you want to look at people who in theory are eligible but not necessarily receiving it, because let's take either EITC or welfare reform, any of these difference things. If you only allowed for people who were receiving it in the before and after period, there are these, what we'll call, let's say, non-entrants or entrants in the welfare reform. It's easy to understand. The welfare benefits were cut back. In the post period, you'd have people who would have been on welfare in the pre-period but aren't. So we're basing the identification strategy based on their characteristics to allow for the actual people who are getting EITC to change in the before and after period. So there's people in the before period who may be qualified for it but aren't taking it, but they are in the after period, same characteristics.
And that's especially true. Actually, that problem is less acute when you're only looking at expansions, not contractions, right? If you're looking at expansions and you're trying to look at...
Yeah, so that could be a real problem in an expansion setting. So by basing it on their education level and the fact that they have a qualifying child, then we allow for that. So in both the pre and post period, it should be the same group.
Okay,
Yeah.
so then here's a related question. So the EITC really, I mean, it's really I mean, you characterize it, it's really an increase in wealth, not an increase in income, right? I mean, it's kind of a lump sum payment, and that's part of the policy strategy.
Right, well, I mean, the EITC,
spread around.
well, actually, technically, a recipient can choose to have it on a per pay period basis, just like withholding. So you are allowed to
Very
choose
few
that.
people do,
Yeah,
right?
but it's single digit percentage do that. So the vast majority of people who receive the EITC receive it as a lump sum after they file their taxes, generally in February. And there's some interesting research looking at, for example, how that affects their consumption. So generally, it appears, I mean, to an economist, this makes no sense because they should take it as it comes and then they can use it or earn interest on it, but instead they're letting the government basically save it for them and turn it back to them. But it appears that a lot of people who receive the EITC benefit use it to buy durable goods. So in February, there's a spike in goods like fixing your car or things like that that they can't do throughout the year.
Right. Which is why I would think that the responses, if we're really trying to isolate, is the effect of the EITC, your response would be really lumpy depending on what part of the year you're being asked.
And we did add month controls to the regression to make sure that month of interview didn't affect it. As a matter of fact, on a future paper that I'm going to work on with Carol, actually, on single mothers, we're going to specifically look at the month of February and see whether or not among single mothers who would be eligible, is there a spike in their subjective well-being and other measures, because it'll be another attempt to get at the causal impact of income on these
And
measures.
one last question. Were there other, so were you only looking at the 1990 text?
This particular paper only considers the 1990 OBRA, yeah.
Okay, so it shouldn't surprise you that I remember very little about that bill.
Yeah.
But it was a really comprehensive bill. There was a big change in capital gains also. And essentially, what I'm wondering is if there are other. I mean, if the variable you're looking at are people with or without children. There are lots of other variables that involve litigation. I'm sorry, legislation that could affect that.
Right, and I guess we believe by limiting it to those with high school or less, we're sort of cutting out people who might own, large percent. Most people who own stock and other types of capital things wouldn't be in our group, given that they don't have high school degrees. But yeah, there could be some other components of that bill.
Some of my law school classmates qualify for the EITC.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's all these, like when you're a student, right, exactly. I mean, because your income is low, there's other reasons, or you work part of the year, only a few months, but you have a high base salary, you would actually qualify too. There's no there's no control over your hourly wages. It's purely based on your annual earned income. So there's a little problems like that, sure.
Yeah, so I have a kind of a technical question for Carol. One of the measures of capability you have in the paper is, can people in this country get if they're working hard, right? So what I was a little bit thinking about last night was, this is one of those questions that possibly could mean different things to different people, right? So if you're asking me in my capability of having lived in the U.S. for 10 years, what I would understand as an English, I would be thinking, I'm asking simply, if I work hard, can I advance in society substantially? I'm comparing myself with basically the entirety of society, including people who work as hard as I do and people who are completely lazy, right? On the other hand, if you put this question in Chinese or Japanese, if you ask me again, there's a large likelihood I would be thinking more along the lines, or I think my peers in China, for example, would be thinking more along the lines of, if I work hard, can I get ahead as much as people who are working about as similarly hard as I am? So the way you understand the question, it's some level of how much you value inequality is already kind of ingrained and built into the way you understand the question. And so the correlations that you find in the explanation part where, inequality does not seem to bother people in countries where they think perceived mobility is high, et cetera, those may not necessarily indicate a causal correlationship between perceived mobility and how much I care about inequality. It's rather that the way I understand the question sometimes depends on how much I care about inequality in the first place. And if that's true, then basically you're having, even though you're asking them one question, they're actually answering different questions. And I was wondering whether you might think this is possibly some kind of a stats problem for the overall results.
If I was worried about, I mean, I've done a lot of work on why people care about inequality and how inequality affects well-being, and if that's where I were trying to measure, I'm not sure I would infer conclusions about that other than suggestive from this question, but that's not what we're trying to get at with this question. So,
you're trying to get at perceived mobility with this question, right? Well, what I'm saying is I can see a scenario in which certain people would answer this question as a conflation of perceived social mobility plus how much they care about inequality, whereas other people would simply say this is raw perceived social mobility, and therefore you have basically two different sets of people answering different questions.
right. Well, I mean, the best we can do to the extent that they are culturally shared beliefs, we're controlling for country, we've got our country dummies. That's about what we can do. I don't see it as a huge statistical problem. I mean, one way to just check that would be to just do an ordered logit of the determinants of the answers to that question, right? Look at sociodemographics, look at countries, look at other things, and see if there's stark patterns. But it's a good point. I don't think it's sort of a giant statistical problem.
Matt, I can't remember, when are we supposed to?
We go to 1.
We can, okay, so then
Yeah.
you're next in the queue.
Okay. So I have just a comment on the wonderful dialogue with Carol and Walter, which I think is really important. I mean, it's so important for anyone who cares about capabilities, and I think anyone who cares about people realizing their wants should care about capabilities, because capabilities are things that allow people to realize their wants. So this is really, so my take is that in a sense you're both right. As I think Walter's right that there are a whole variety of non-income capabilities that are genuinely capabilities. And I think Sen would say that. Indeed, Sen, by contrast with Nussbaum, famously refuses to pin down a list of capabilities. I mean, he wants to be very inclusive in terms of what capabilities are. And so, yeah, being able to see your family, local know-how, feeling at home, being able to go to your ancestral home, all these kinds of things are capabilities. So, for example, if we imagine a scenario in which suddenly, in some rural area, oil is discovered, and let's imagine everyone shares in that, although some people, reap more of the oil wealth, but everyone shares in that. It's an open question whether people's capabilities on balance have increased or not, because they all have more income, but they may feel disrupted, this may break balance and so forth, right? So I think that's what you're right, But in one of your answers to Walter, you seem to deny the importance of some of these non-income capabilities. I wouldn't say that. I think your stronger answer to him was, if you move and you don't move back, then by your own lights, your capabilities are better moving, right? I mean, point number one is, again, if we care about people realizing their values, the ultimate criterion of capability are people's well-informed values. And number two, if you move, that's a revealed preference that, you think your capabilities on balance are better in the place that you've moved to as opposed to the place from which you've moved, right? So if that's true, one would expect an ambiguous or a weak relationship between objective measures of capability like income and EWB, given the possibility that we have these unobservable capabilities. On the other hand, we'd expect a strong relationship between migrant status and EWB, right? So you actually looked at that, right? And what's the result?
Well, typically the result is people say, well, migrants are less happy than non-migrants in their place of destination. But what we've been looking at is their status before they leave, and it turns out they're less happy before they migrate. So they migrate because they're unhappy where they're leaving.
Right. But a finding, again, modulo rescaling, a finding that migrants have a lower level, now by happiness you mean EWB, right? That recent migrants I mean, in a way, the test would be not recent migrants, but migrants, people who've migrated,
And
you know,
assimilated. Yeah, that's what
years
I'm trying
ago.
to do.
They
That's what I'm-
clearly should have higher EWB.
That's what I'm trying to do.
Yeah,
But we
that's
know
really-
already that they have higher EWB than they did before they left, even before they've assimilated. So the typical study compares them when they got there to everybody who's been there. But what we're saying is, no, look at where they were before they left. They were less happy before they left. They're slightly happier now. After they assimilate for 5 years, maybe they'll be even happier. Just a note of clarification, I don't take lightly the fact that people can't easily go back and see their families and all these things. I think that, they're incredibly important things to human well-being. I guess I hadn't thought of them in the sense of agency, and I think more of it if all you can do is see your family and you don't have any other choices, that's a very different thing from.
But again, I think, Sen talks about the ability to, in fact, realize what you want, and one of the things people want is to have a family life, right? So I think you weaken your case by denying those capabilities. I think, again, the better answer is, as a matter of revealed choice, migrants who don't return, must believe, unless they're making radical mistakes, that their capabilities have improved.
Yeah, and they've made, I also, and I think I say it more in the text, that people are making sacrifices to get new capability, to acquire new agency. And so I don't at all dismiss the point you're making. I'm just saying, sort of on average, I think people have,
But what the failure to move back shows is that they prefer this bundle of capabilities over this bundle of capabilities.
But they've given up.
It doesn't show that there are more capabilities here than there. It just shows they prefer this bundle over that bundle.
But that's the relevant measure, Walter, right? I mean,
A preference.
on a preference-based view.
Oh, absolutely.
The relevant
That's
measure
the
is
whole
what
point.
people want.
That's my whole point. It's not the amount of capability that matters, it's the preferences.
I guess, I go back to saying if I keep my, kind of just much more straightforward development economist hat on, preferences matter, but, somebody go back to the rural farm, in the Sierra in Peru, I'm not from the Sierra, but I'm from Peru, right? And, somebody who doesn't even know what the capabilities are that they don't have, doesn't realize that their child does not have to die of a preventable disease by age 5, does not know that they don't need to die at age 50. By objective welfare metrics, their life is worse than somebody that doesn't face those constraints. I can't dismiss that, and.
Yeah, I don't want to dismiss that.
Right.
I actually think that's even more convincing than the revealed preference approach, because the revealed preference approach suggests it's consistent with the idea that the rural person has the capability of leaving, whereas the urban person doesn't. Because with the additional wealth opportunities also comes additional responsibilities. So the fact that they're not leaving doesn't mean that is not a revealed preference story necessarily.
No, I was saying the opposite. I was saying the fact they're not leaving doesn't reveal much. They may not realize capabilities. The fact that they leave and don't come back does reveal their evaluation of the capabilities.
Because they could go back.
Exactly.
Only if they couldn't go back.
Why couldn't they
Only
go back?
if it's
Right.
destroyed.
Why couldn't they go back?
Yeah.
For financial responsibilities.
Dan and then Eric wanted to join on.
I think just adding to the Walters and Eric's and other points on that. One of the reasons I think the capabilities approach is so appealing is because just the basic idea has so little content. All it means is having, I think what you're onto, your basic concern about capabilities and agency is very substantive, and I'm sitting here trying to puzzle out, how do you really get at the root concern? But the basic idea of capabilities, like saying people are doing better in terms of capabilities, sounds clear. It doesn't just mean having more options. Because you could do that by proliferating, giving people access to 12,000 kinds of aspirin or something, really trivial option. So it has something to do with the importance of the capabilities, like health and being able to reach a normal lifespan.
And the importance of the options.
But it's without having some metric of what are the capabilities that matter and what counts as an increase in capabilities, it's hard to say whether people's capabilities have increased in one situation or another. And it may be that in some sense, like somebody might choose, well, I prefer to have a slightly reduced choice set And that's a better capability set from my perspective than the one I have, than this wider choice set. And so which is, more capability. So it's not a fundamental problem with what you're doing from my point of view. It's just an area for further development.
Yeah, no, and I very much appreciate the points. Eric?
I also wanted to reinforce what Walter was just saying by pointing out that it's not even clear that it makes sense to ask whether a person has more capability before or after a change. And if we take SEM seriously, it sounds as though there might be an infinity of capabilities at any given time, an uncountable infinity, in fact. And so if you add one or subtract one, that's not a meaningful question. What is a meaningful question is whether people prefer this bundle to that, and whether they reveal that in their choices. Those are things we can study scientifically.
Was there anyone else I missed on this topic, just right now?
I just had a clarifying question from Matt as to your clarification. So when we're talking about capabilities and making decisions based on capabilities, are we implicitly saying that I think the bundle of capabilities that we're comparing of rural versus urban, for example, is the entire universe that we're considering? Or should I think of this somewhat by analogy to your point about mental states, where we should consider capabilities and a number of things outside of capabilities that are also potentially rational ways to make a decision? I asked this partly because when you said that a revealed preference of choosing the urban bundle and not moving back means that this bundle of capabilities is better. But if there are other considerations, emotional or otherwise, that were part of that mix, then that's harder to say.
Yeah, I mean, as a preference type, I think that everything is normally relevant, at least the level of well-being, insofar as it's something that people prefer. And I think the interpersonal, question is hard. So if people with different preferences, but the claim is just that, in deciding which is the better, or, what's the larger or the better bundle of capabilities for a particular person, that person's informed preferences are the only guide. And I would include in that emotional, so Carol finds it odd to think of happiness or emotional dispositions or what have you as itself a capability. But again, I just view that as one of the attributes in the bundle that people might prefer.
Pretty much got one, and we've run through our. Oh, I'm sorry. Did you want to follow?
Yeah, something
very brief. Then we'll
slightly different, but probably connects. When I talk to people immigrated from Italy to the United States, part of my family, the idea is, they say we are a bit nostalgic, a bit sad from living in that small village, but we did it for our kids. And even when they're old and they have lost their partner, you ask why you're not coming back. Say, no, I want to stay close to my kids. So this element of offspring, I'm not sure that is factored in index of life satisfaction.
Yeah, I'll be very brief too. When I've talked about intertemporal trade-offs, that we haven't solved that problem with happiness metrics, because a lot of people do precisely make these choices for their kids. And I think they derive a certain kind of well-being from them, even though...
So it's factored in.
Well, I don't think we really have a good sense how, but yes. And I think that's part of this whole calculation. It's like you could even be saying whose capabilities. Well, maybe I miss my mother in the village, but I really want my kids to go to school and have a better life than I did.
We should really explore family well-being measures.
Yeah, expected.
One of the points. I think family well-being measures will get at some of that. This is an underexplored area.
Actually, I think there is in the American panel the question about family well-being. There is also the ethnic origin and when they migrate in the American panel. So this can be used.
Thank you. All right, let's thank our speakers.